Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I guess if you have questions, you're to chat them in, and then maybe I'll just kind of stop along the way to give you the opportunity to get those questions answered before we get too far down the road. So Plants for Birds is an initiative of the National Audubon Society. It was started several years ago, and as a chapter of the National Audubon Society, Jawhawk Audubon has really adopted this program. And Jawhawk Audubon Society, we are based in Lawrence, and we serve Northeast Kansas, a good part of Northeast Kansas. There's also an Audubon chapter, Burroughs Audubon chapter in Missouri. And so if most of you are in the Wyandotte County area, you can be a member of both. And we do different things, and everybody is welcome to join. So first I want to say I have no idea, I guess maybe a question I could have asked at the beginning was how many of you are actually birders, bird watchers. And so some of the things that I have to say may be a little basic for you, but I'm going to sort of speak to the group as if you don't have a really high level of knowledge about birds. One thing that I think we all know about birds is that they migrate. Some birds migrate, some birds don't. And this map just is kind of a general overview of the migratory patterns of birds that we might see in our area. So one of the things that the Plants for Birds program is really cognizant of is that birds need to be able to find resources along their migratory pathways. And some birds are here throughout the entire year, and they don't migrate at all. Other birds come up here just for the nesting season. Some birds come here just in the winter because I guess compared to where they breed, our winter looks pretty good. Some birds that breed up in the high Arctic areas. And other birds just kind of pass through here. So we have different seasonality, and when we think about food for birds and other resources, we need to think about the timing of bird migrations. So this bird here is, let me see if you can hear it. And I don't know if you can actually hear the song through your connection, but what I hear is the beautiful song of the wood thrush. And the wood thrush is a migratory bird. It nests in forests. It spends its winter down mostly in Central America. And the map that shows the migratory pathway, pretty much it's an eastern forest bird in the light blue color. And Kansas is just on the very western edge of its range, of its breeding range. But this is a bird that we do get in our eastern forest woodlands, such as in Wyandotte County, Leavenworth County. It's in parts of Douglas County, just during the breeding season. So this is kind of what the habitat has come to look like, though, in much of our area. Instead of those vast forests that you see in the upper left of this picture, we have little habitat patches. So more and more the habitat is being shrunk down, and so those little patches that still exist are extremely important for the survival of these birds. And this map shows, this graph shows what's happened with the populations of the wood thrush, mostly due to that declining habitat. We have data on bird population trends from the breeding bird surveys, which have been conducted since the 1960s. So we have at least a good 50-year data set on what's happening with our native birds. And we see with the wood thrush, since the beginning of the time that we've been collecting data, a precipitous decline, just fewer and fewer of them. And this isn't just the wood thrush that this is happening to. About 40 to 50% of all migratory songbirds have experienced declines. I do want to mention too that this is a 50-year data set starting, as I said, in the 60s. So what happened before that? A lot of the factors that come into play that have led to the declines of these birds go back at least a century before that. So by the time we were starting to take numbers, collect numbers, there had already been, we can only assume, a serious decline in bird numbers. So this map shows, here's Wyandotte County, and the green is woodland habitat. And a lot of people are surprised that this is woodland habitat at the time of early settlement, so about the 1850s. In about that time period, the government, the General Land Office, went out and conducted surveys through the entire state and other states to document the condition of the land. And this was done prior to the settlement period. And so from those maps that were created in the 1850s, we know where the significant stand of forest and woodlands were. So Wyandotte County, this is, I think the little star here is Bonner Springs. Wyandotte County at that time was about 75% forested. Other than that, we see forested areas along, of course, along the Kansas River, quite a bit of forested area in Leavenworth County and Jefferson County on slopes. As you go farther west, of course, there was less and less. The point being, and this is a terrible map, I was going to remake this, but I just didn't quite get around to it, is this is a part of Leavenworth County, Wyandotte County now, and it's an aerial photo. I think it's from 2015, but I think you can get the general idea that this is the Camp Nash area here, but so much development has taken place. And of course, those of you who live in the county don't need to be told that. So this is a graphic example really of what's happened to the habitat for the wood thrush and other forest-loving birds. This is the Cerulean Warbler, one of the birds that does inhabit the forested areas. We find it in at Fort Leavenworth, at Meridocene National Wildlife Refuge, and a few other places in the state. They've experienced declines in that 50-year period of almost 80%. So there's only 20% of the number of individuals of the Cerulean Warbler now as there was in the 1960s. And I've been focusing on forested birds a lot because that was the habitat of Wyandotte County and far eastern Kansas. But of course, Kansas was mostly a prairie state. The vast majority of the state was prairie. And this is meadowlark. I call it eastern. You could call it western because by looking at them, you can't really tell the difference. A typical grassland bird, a bird of the tall grass prairie. So this picture is actually taken in Anderson County at the Anderson County Prairie Preserve, which is owned by the Nature Conservancy and managed by the Kansas Biological Survey. But this is a lot of what even eastern Kansas would have looked like. This is kind of what it looks like now. I think this picture was taken a little bit farther east of here, maybe in Illinois or Indiana or something, but I don't think that it's news to anyone that most of our grassland has been converted to row crop agriculture. About 52% of our landscape has been converted to agriculture. So again, we have half the amount of habitat for grassland birds. Throughout the US, about 43% of the land is now in the urban-suburban matrix. So it looks like this, which gets me to the question of what do birds need? The basics are the basics for everyone, right? They need food, they need water, They need shelter from predators and from the elements, and of course, places to nest. Guess what? This doesn't provide that. These are all non-native plants, and not very many of them. There's not much going on in the understory. There are just a few shrubs here, but for the most part, this type of a landscape provides nothing for birds. There's no bird habitat here. In my earlier years, when I was up in Nebraska, I used to work at a store that sold bird feeding supplies. It was a great store called Wild Habitat. It wasn't affiliated with any of the franchises. It was a family-owned business in Lincoln, Nebraska, Wild Habitat bird store. And one of the stores was located in an area that was rapidly developing with suburban developments. And people would come in and they would spend hundreds of dollars on bird feeders and bird feeding supplies. And then they would come in and they'd say, I bought all this stuff, but I don't have any birds. But this is the kind of area that they were trying to attract birds to. And it's not just about putting out seed for birds. There have to be other things. And again, this is something that you might see in rural parts of eastern Kansas, where someone does have the opportunity to provide habitat, but this is kind of typically how we do a lot of our landscaping, is a lot of mowed lawn. Mowed lawn does nothing for birds and generally for wildlife. This type of a landscape would have the opportunity to we could put back some of the habitat for grassland birds like the meadowlarks and the grasshopper sparrows and other grassland nesting birds. But if you're going to put down long grass and keep it mowed, you're not going to have anything for those birds. On the other hand, we can do things in our yards. And that's where you, as gardeners mostly, really have a huge role to play. Not just in creating your own gardens and yards, but in helping to get the word out. And I know that as master gardeners, that's a big part of what you do. This is a yard in Topeka. A friend of mine, Jeff Hansen, a big birder, also a big gardener, very involved in the Kansas Native Plant Society. And he's created a beautiful haven in his in-town yard for birds, as well as insects and other things. Again, this one's actually taken out of the state someplace, but this one shows more of the sun-loving prairie types of plants that we could grow in our yards. So I'm going to talk about food for birds. That's a huge limiting factor. If you plant for food, in most cases, the other things will come along with the exception of water. Water is one of those things where you put out water, that's all you have to do is just put out some water, especially in the winter, put a heater in your water container so that there's open water. But keep in mind that when birds are in our neighborhoods, they're not looking at our property per se. They're looking at a much larger landscape. And so when you're thinking about what birds need and where they're going to get it, your particular yard doesn't have to have everything. And I say that in the context of water, because if there's, say, a stream that runs through your neighborhood someplace or something that's mostly open, then you really don't even need to worry about water. And as we talk about trees, especially, you don't need to have all the bird trees in your yard. You probably can't fit them all in there anyhow, but you look in a larger area and see what's there and what's missing and how what you do in your yard can help fill in the gaps. So this is the question about what birds eat. And I don't think this is news to anyone. Berries and fruits, nectar, nuts and seeds, and insects. And I don't expect you to read this. I'll let you know that we have a lot of resources on the website for Jawhawk Audubon, jawhawkaudubon.org. And I'll show you at the end of the presentation some of the resources we have there. But one of the things that we've done is we've created this list of common birds that one would find in backyards in the Lawrence area, what those birds eat. And different birds have different preferences. Some birds, a lot of birds will eat all different kinds of things. They eat different kinds of things depending on time of year. They do have tendencies. And so goldfinches, for example, we know those are regular visitors to our bird feeders, even in the summer, because most of their diet is seeds. But a lot of other birds that eat seeds also eat other things. And some of them actually prefer other things. So this is a gray catbird. And again, some of you might know your bird so well and others of you might not, but this is a gray catbird and it's a fruit eater. It really likes fruit. And this is poke, a native weed. I love poke. It's really great. It has great food for birds. And this is an example, a gray catbird, of a bird that really is a specialist on fruit. It will eat other things, but if you have fruit, you will have gray catbirds. Another plant that's really popular with a lot of birds, fruit-producing plant, is poison ivy. So if you have poison ivy in kind of away places and it's not really bothering you, you can let that lay there because those fruits are really good for birds. Of course, some birds eat nuts, not very many because they're too big. But of course, acorns are eaten by blue jays. Seeds of grasses and other plants are popular, especially in the wintertime. This time of year, there aren't a lot of seeds available. Birds are eating something else, but in the wintertime, it's really important that we have seeds left on the stalks and on the ground for our birds like this song sparrow. Again, this is a picture of a white-throated sparrow. We get a lot of sparrows here in the winter. They are kind of a group of birds that there are some sparrows that are here in the breeding season, but other sparrows that just come here for the winter. And the white-throated sparrow, really a seed specialist that we'll find in our yards in the winter. And then of course there's nectar. We're all familiar with the ruby-throated hummingbird that likes to have nectar plants. And so we think of them as liking red tubular flowers. Tubular is important, red not so much. There are other plants that have a tubular way for the bird to get in there, and they may not be red. So color doesn't matter, structure does. And this bird, this is a Cape May warbler, just a migrant, just kind of passes through. And this bird actually is a nectar feeder as well. Notice it doesn't have that beak to get into those tubular flowers. This bird will snip the flower buds off at the end, just right where the nectar is. It'll just stick its little beak in there, snip it off, and get that nectar right from the source. A tree that provides that type of nectar would be the American linden or basswood. Then there are, so insects, a lot of insects feed on plants. So that's where the connection between native plants and insects comes in. We need to grow the native plants in order to be able to grow insects. We've talked about, we've got fruit, we've got nuts, seeds, nectar, but insects are a huge group of critters, animals that are super important for birds. And so I'm going to talk about some of the insects that are eaten by birds. This is an eastern phoebe, an early spring migrant. And these come up just about the time that our flying insects are really getting going. They don't migrate, they migrate from the south, but not that far south. So they get up here early. And when they arrive in March, they need to be able to find some flying insects. So that brings me to another point about feeding and feeding strategies. Different birds might eat different things. A lot of birds have different feeding strategies. So the eastern phoebe will fly out to get insects on the wing. It's not, say, picking them up off the bark or something like that. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about really relates to insect diversity and why we need to have a lot of different types of insects in our yards and our neighborhoods. Speaking of feeding strategies, these are two woodpeckers, the hairy woodpecker on the right and the downy on the left. They look very similar, one's bigger than the other. They both will bore into bark and under bark and into the wood to find overwintering grubs. So in order for these birds to be able to find that food, we need to have some dead and dying wood in our area. And I recognize that nobody wants to have like standing dead trees hanging over their house. But one of the things that people do is if you have a dead tree, don't cut the whole thing down, leave a certain length of it, and that will be the habitat for these grubs. Now, there are a whole bunch of birds that eat a whole bunch of different insects, and I'm just going to say that pretty much every insect out there is going to be bird food. Again, as I was saying, some specialize more on others, and this is a rose-breasted grosbeak. It comes up here and nests in our area. It winters farther to the south in the tropics. A lot of birds come here because we actually have more food for them during the breeding season than they can get in the tropics. I guess I don't have to tell you, we have a lot of insects here. And when you have the right habitat, you have a lot of insects. And so that's why, from an evolutionary perspective, birds migrated up here was because there was such an abundance of food for them to raise their young compared to what they would find in their wintering areas. So these rose-breasted grosbeaks, they eat a lot of different things. They eat ants and butterflies, but they really like bees and beetles. And this is a yellow-billed cuckoo, and it likes to eat things that we don't really like to have in our yard, tent caterpillars and fall webworms. I understand if you don't want to have these around, but if you do have them around and they're annoying you, just think that cuckoos like hairy caterpillars. And just a couple more birds here, a couple of kinglets that like to forage way high in the top of trees, which brings me to the point that a lot of what birds are eating, you may not even see. A lot of birds do forage high in the canopy, way up at the top. So sometimes you'll see birds up there, but you don't know what the heck they're doing up there. They're picking a lot of little tiny insects and other little tiny and different things that are up there. Migrants, such as this black-throated blue warbler, another bird that passes through our area, they take a lot of small insect prey from the underside of leaves. And then there's this whole other group of arthropods. Arthropods eat insects, and birds eat arthropods too. Like this Carolina wren eats a lot of spiders. Spiders are actually really critical in the diets of many birds, even in the winter, and the Carolina wren is here throughout the winter. And then up in the upper left-hand corner is a towhee. Down in the lower right is a brown thrasher, and these birds forage in the understory, the leaf litter. They forage in the leaf litter and they get centipedes and millipedes and leftover seeds and all sorts of stuff that has fallen into the leaf litter, snails, all kinds of things. So these birds will forage a lot in the leaf litter. And so we want to make sure that we've got good leaf litter. If you remember that photo I showed you of the suburban neighborhood with the few shrubs, and then some mulch down and then grass. So there's no leaf litter in there. So you're not going to get these kinds of birds. So these are my general tips before I actually start talking more specifically about plants. These are my general tips for gardening for birds. Grow more plants, everything except for lawn, because lawn is really, in most cases, an ecological desert, unless you have a bee lawn, but I'm not going to go there today. Layer the vegetation because birds forage in different layers of the vegetation, from the leaf litter all the way up to the high tops of trees. Leave seed heads for birds that spend the winter here or birds that come here in the winter. So there's an abundant source of seeds. Of course, leave the leaves, leave some dead branches when possible, and then going native. So I'm going to talk next about going native.
Do wood thrushes need deep forest, or do they mainly nest on the edge of forests?
They will nest in smaller pieces of habitat. There's some question as to how successfully they will, because a lot of these birds that are ecologically deep woods birds are subject to predation. So as we have more edge habitat around the forest patches, there's more opportunity for predators to get in there. And house cats are certainly a major predator of many birds, but you've got raccoons and skunks and, of course, whatever, depending on what layer of the canopy or the ground the bird is nesting in. For example, I'm diverging a little bit, but the ovenbird is another deep forest bird native to our area that will nest in smaller habitat patches, but it nests on the ground. So it's highly susceptible to predation. So in answer to your question, they will nest, but they may not be as successful nesters. And so that's what we call an ecological sink. The bird sees a forested habitat, says, okay, this is good for me, doesn't recognize that there might be a high level.
Okay, and a comment, I have poison ivy because the birds brought it to me.
Sorry.
Question for
brought it to you because they like it.
Yeah. Should we
I know, I have too much of it myself.
Yeah, I do too. Should we take down the hummingbird feeders when we have flowers that appeal to hummingbirds?
No, not necessarily. I have both. And I like to see the hummingbird come up to my window. So I have my hummingbird feeder close to my window, but I also have hummingbird plants. And keep in mind too, that hummingbirds, they get sugar water from nectar and from what we put in our feeders, but they also need protein. And so they're eating a lot of really small insects, little gnats and things like that as well. You can leave it all out there and enjoy them.
And someone else says natives are grown specifically within 50 to 100 miles of your home. And the next question, how much of a hummingbird's diet is insect spiders versus nectar? Douglas Tallamy says 80% insect spiders, but someone who works in the nutrition department of a zoo says 90% nectar. Two very different statistics.
And I can't answer that, and I would not argue with either of them. Well, but I do think maybe the major point there is that there's a whole lot we don't know. And Doug Tallamy, who I will talk about as we go on, has been really instrumental in putting together a lot of information. He'll be the first to admit that there's so much need for research. He conducts his research in the East. There could be regional variations. There could be variations based on time of year. There are so many variables, which I think gets to this, the point of that we just need to have a lot of stuff in our yards.
Agreed. And one last question, why are sunflower seeds in many bird seed packages?
They actually have, so the black oil sunflower seed, not the gray striped, the black oil sunflower seed has been determined to be the favorite of backyard birds. And believe it or not, people have conducted research at universities, including the University of Nebraska, where I was, on bird food preferences. So if you were to choose only one type of seed, you would choose the black oil sunflower seed because it's preferred by the widest variety of birds that we would get at our feeders. And I should say, there are a whole lot of birds that will never come to a feeder. But of those that do, the black oil sunflower is the food of choice.
Okay, and someone else said everybody loves black oil sunflower seeds, including squirrels and raccoons.
True.
The birds are currently ignoring my black oil sunflower seed feeder. Why would that be?
Well, I think maybe as we go on in the presentation, that question will be answered. If it's not, come back with it.
Okay, well, and one last one. I feed black oil sunflower seed in peanut pieces. The peanuts don't go over as well in the summer. Is this normal?
Well, because of their oil content and because they're not protected, they may actually go rancid.
Well, that concludes our questions.
This is a little off base here, but basswood flowers, as anybody who has a basswood tree in their yard, which I do, you know that there are just tons and tons of bees that like those basswood flowers. And we talked about how some birds really like bees. So here's the planting part for the gardeners. I wasn't just going to talk about birds. We want to plant something meaningful. Given what we've been talking about so far, we want to make sure that we plant things that are actually good for our birds and good for the ecosystem. During the breeding season, which is what we're in now, birds eat a ton of insects. This goes to the question of why you're not seeing so many birds come to your seed. A lot of birds that are here year-round, like the black-capped chickadee, comes to our bird feeders very readily in the winter. It's probably the most common bird and America's favorite bird, by the way. They eat all of these black oil sunflower seeds during the winter, and then they just abandon us during the breeding season because they are eating insects. A lot of birds that eat seeds in the winter switch over to insects during the breeding season. And so that's why we don't see so many birds at our feeders. The exception, and I'm not going to say this is the only exception, but one exception are the goldfinches, because goldfinches pretty much eat seeds year round. Now you may not see them in your yards because they go someplace else to nest. They like to nest along stream corridors and places where there's more water, but they still are really tied to a diet of seeds. So these are the three main tenets of our Plants for Birds program. Grow stuff, trees, shrubs, vines, flowers, whatever it is, just grow stuff. Lots and lots of them to replace what's been lost. Go mostly native, and I'll talk about that. So here's a chickadee, and I don't know if this is a black-capped chickadee or a Carolina chickadee. Doug Tallamy has conducted a lot of research in the East looking at the Carolina chickadee, which is very closely related to our black-capped chickadee. One of the things he found was that for one pair of chickadees to raise one nest full of babies, it takes between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars. Baby birds eat mostly caterpillars. Little birds in the nest, they eat almost exclusively insects. About 96% of the birds that we find here are fed insect food in the nest. A big exception being the mourning dove, but I'm not going into that. Nearly all birds in the nest need insects, and most of that insect food is caterpillar. So when I talk about caterpillar, I'm not talking about the big honking monarch caterpillar for these little guys here, right? I'm talking about little caterpillars. And these parents are constantly feeding, feeding, feeding. So one of the things that Tallamy also has found was that to find those caterpillars, the chickadee parents were foraging most of the time on native plants. They were finding those little caterpillars on native plants about 86% of the time. Yards dominated by non-native plants were 60% less likely to have breeding Carolina chickadees. And those chickadees that did nest raised fewer young. So that's a lot of statistics, but I think that's where the research of Tallamy really is valuable, because he has a whole bunch of graduate students out there constantly collecting all of this information, because there's so much to know, so much we don't know. He's focused on these chickadees to some extent, that they need native plants to find all of those little caterpillars. So here's an example of a little caterpillar. One of the reasons that these caterpillars are so important is because they actually contain carotenoids. And carotenoids are what gives the adult birds their bright colors. Carotenoids have to come from food. The birds can't, we too, can't produce those in our own bodies. It has to come from food material. Those baby birds are being fed something, and they're being fed these little caterpillars that have eaten plants where they have absorbed those carotenoids. And caterpillars tend to be more nutritious than some other types of insect life that could also be fed to baby birds. Like some baby birds will be given some various types of grubs and things like that. But caterpillars are really the primary source. And so I took a picture this morning of the poke growing in my yard, because I love poke, and it hasn't produced the berries yet. But look at all that leaf damage, and look at that frass. Somebody's busy here, and that's a really good sign. So let me talk about, again, a lot of this, what I'm talking about comes from Tallamy's books. This is Bringing Nature Home, which I think was published maybe in 2004. He has a more recent book out, the name of which escapes me right now, but it has even more detail to help to think about which native plants to grow. So for trees, these are the trees that are attracting the greatest diversity of caterpillars. So oaks, the genus Quercus, as a whole, Tallamy's students counted 557, not individual caterpillars, species of caterpillars, 557 species of caterpillars, 456 species of caterpillar on willow, etc. So these are really the big players in a wooded area. If you're going to grow trees, these are the really important trees to have in your area. Again, this is a viceroy, and it's a little bird dropping caterpillar on willow. So one of the things that I have to look over at my statistics, because I don't remember all of this stuff, but one of the things that Tallamy students determined is that non-native plantings contained only 10% of the number of caterpillars as native plantings. So non-native plantings just don't have the bulk of caterpillars. And this is a good example of how that happens. Our native oaks, again, 557 species of caterpillars, and this ginkgo, non-native ginkgo, had only 5 species of caterpillars. And so when you look at these trees, I bet you're going to find those oak leaves are getting pretty munched, but those ginkgo leaves are not, which is great if you just want to have something that looks pristine. But what we're going for here is actually a functioning ecological system. Other good caterpillar trees, this is a prothonotary warbler, another bird that just comes up. Yeah, I'll say that name again, prothonotary warbler that comes up and breeds here, just comes up for the breeding season. So wild cherry, a nice tree, it also produces fruits, as well as a lot of, as well as being popular with caterpillars. Box elder, cottonwoods, a lot of the nut trees, elms, and ashes. Of course, we're not planting ashes anymore, we're losing ashes. And so one of the trees that you could use to replace some of those lost ash trees is the linden or basswood. Of course, Kansas really is mostly a prairie state. And so a lot of the plants, the native plants that we would put in would be plants that we would find in the native prairie. And so we have asters and black-eyed Susan and gay feathers, coneflowers, solidago, common name escapes me, but goldenrod. And I will go more into, you don't have to pay a whole lot of attention to what I'm saying there. I'll go more into actually which plants you can find in your area in a little bit. And I do want to make a quick distinction. I probably don't need to do this for you all, but a lot of times we see pollinators on plants and we think, oh, that's a really good plant for birds. But there's a huge distinction between nectar and pollen and what the caterpillars are actually eating, what's actually good to grow caterpillars. We of course need nectar and we need pollen. We need those for bees and other pollinators, but the caterpillars are eating the other parts of the plant. Their growth is dependent on the stems and leaves. And so what we're talking about with the Plants for Birds program is not just having nectar and pollen, but having plants that the larval stages of those pollinators can eat. And so much of that is dependent on the co-evolution of the native insect life with the native plants. So Tallamy, in his more recent book, has really refined his thinking about native plants and said, you know, not all native plants are created equal as far as being able to grow these caterpillars. And so I talked about the trees and which trees are most important to grow caterpillars. And these are some of the herbaceous plants, the prairie plants, that also are really important for growing caterpillars. And he calls these keystone plants. So goldenrod is super important. 77 different species of caterpillars were found on the all of the goldenrods. And sunflowers, again, are super important. Of course, there are many species of goldenrod, many species of sunflower. Strawberry, not so many, so this kind of surprised me. These plants in particular are super important to grow caterpillars to feed birds. And this is a little bit messy slide here, but again, since the flowers aren't out yet, this is my Joe Pye weed, which was on that list. Joe Pye weed in this study supported 25 different species of caterpillars. And so this is Joe Pye weed leaves being munched here. And then in the background, there's also some Virginia creeper, which is another good native plant for caterpillars for eating the leaves, but also the fruits are very valuable for birds too. And of course, everybody wants to plant shrubs. We have many shrubs that are native to our area, and all of this information is coming up as far as where you can find it. But I took this picture this morning of my elderberry. So there's some nice frass there, some nice munched leaves. So this is doing its job. It's feeding caterpillars over here, feeding caterpillars. So my elderberry is feeding caterpillars, as well, of course, as the fruit feeding catbirds and robins and mockingbirds. Okay, I want to talk about natives and what I mean by natives. The echinacea in the middle is echinacea.
Do you want to entertain some of the questions?
I would love to.
Okay, the questions: are mealworms good for baby?
Sure. I'm only hesitating because I'm thinking about all the stuff that's out there in our yards and things, and really the necessity of putting out mealworms. I would say if you feel like you need to put out mealworms, then you don't have enough habitat in your yard. There's nothing wrong with them. They're fine. I would recommend putting out some more native plants, and then you don't need to put all that money into mealworms.
And there's a comment, Tallamy has said that a landscape has to be a minimum of 70%, or was it 80%, native plants to be a suitable nesting area for chickadees.
Well, their numbers are tough, right? Because he's conducted research in a particular part of the country and under particular circumstances. And I hate to put strict numbers on things. What I would say is that it's clear from his research that we need to have mostly native so that we get those caterpillars that are feeding on the native plants. So we do our best, right? We do our best. All of us have non-native plants in our yard. That's okay, but just bulk it up with some more natives if you can.
Okay. Caterpillars, except for some hairy moth caterpillars, are also soft and easier to stuff down a baby bird's throat. And then the title that you were wanting was Nature's Best Hope is Tallamy's latest.
Perfect, thank you.
For his Oaks books.
Thank you. Nature's Best Hope.
Does anything eat the Japanese beetle?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know the answer to that. And one of the problems that we have, of course, is that with those introduced species, they have been released from their natural predators. Now, whether something else is actually able to eat them, I can't answer that question. But I would imagine that Extension probably knows the answer to that.
One participant said, I've seen a cardinal grab up a Japanese beetle.
Well, I hope they ate it.
Yeah.
Sometimes birds will pick things and then they start to eat it and then they spit it out.
Okay. As far as I can tell, that's the end of our questions for the moment.
Okay. So let's talk about plants. Native versus non-native plants. In the center of this picture is Echinacea pallida. Echinacea pallida is native to eastern Kansas. In the upper right-hand corner is Echinacea purpurea. It's native to parts of Missouri. Do you care? Especially where you are. There are whole bunches of definitions for what's native and what's not. Generally, somebody might say 50 to 100 miles. A lot depends on what the landscape is like in that distance. If you're finding, like Echinacea pallida, it occurs throughout a large part of eastern Kansas. If you take it and move it 50 miles away, is that a bad thing? I guess I would contend that there's an awful lot we don't know about how native needs to be. So you get as native as you can, and you totally avoid species that are not even native to this country. And that's where our biggest problem comes in with things like Japanese honeysuckle and other types of invasive species that are not really beneficial to our native wildlife. So you get as native as you can. That's my point of view, and I think that there's a diversity. I want to talk about spicebush because this I find a lot of people really tout as a Kansas native shrub that we should plant, and it has those beautiful berries, and it's just lovely. I've tried to grow it in my yard in Jefferson County and have had no success. I mean, it took off and then it just died one year. And if you look at, I don't know what sources you all use, there's a variety of sources out there to look and find out what plants are native in your area, including Audubon, which I'll share. But this is the USDA plants database, and it shows that spicebush is native in Kansas. If you zoom in and look at the county level data, you can see that it's native in southeast Kansas. It's not native in Douglas County or Leavenworth County or Wyandotte County. That's not part within its native range. I don't plant it anymore. Of course, it didn't survive anyhow, but I don't really tout this as a native for our region in Northeast Kansas, because it's really not native here. And one of the reasons that people like spicebush is because it's the host plant for the spicebush swallowtail. Would we even get spicebush swallowtail if we planted this because it's really outside of its native range? I don't know. There are other plants that other shrubs that we can plant that are native to our region. So one of the things, and we're going back to Echinacea again, because it's really, it's readily available, right? And when you go to nurseries, you can find Echinacea. So one of the things that Tallamy talks about, and that I think makes a lot of sense, is when you're looking for plants, you want to try to get as close to native as you can. And if the natives aren't available, which is often true, you cannot find true natives, you go for something that's as similar as possible. And that leads me to talk about cultivars, because that's a lot of what we find in our garden center are cultivars. And some of those may be fine. Some of them probably are not, again, from the perspective of birds would use them, whether for seeds or whether the insects are eating them. When you change things, when you alter things for the nursery trade, you could be altering a whole variety of things, from just height to flower color to flower structure. The more you change, the more likely it is that you're actually going to change the chemical composition of the vegetative parts. And that's where you run into trouble with the caterpillars, is the caterpillars evolve to eat certain plant chemistry. If you change that plant chemistry, then they may not be palatable to those caterpillars any longer. However, they may produce seeds, but that's generally not the most limiting factor. So in this case, we have the Echinacea pallida, native in Northeast Kansas, Echinacea purpurea, parts of Missouri. I'm sure you have pallida in Missouri too. Then there's this cultivar, Echinacea purpurea, Kim's knee-high, which is widely found in nursery centers. It's not very much different in structure from the native echinaceas. It probably produces fine seed. I know nothing about the leaf chemistry. On the other hand, this hot papaya, you're starting to get a little off the deep end with that one. You change the flower structure, and that's where the problems really start coming in. A lot of birds are designed, when they're eating seeds and nectar, they're designed for certain flower structure. So when you start changing the flower structure, you really might be looking for trouble. A little bit of research has been done on yarrow, and one of the things that was found was that this strawberry seduction cultivar was just visited less often than pollinators. And so again, we strive for as native as we can get, so that we're not getting off into that gray area where we just don't have the research. This is one of my favorite shrubs, actually, the Cephalanthus, the buttonbush. And there is a proven winners variety that's available with this. And really the only thing that's different with that is it's shorter. And that's probably a good thing, because people are more likely to plant it. The native one gets pretty big. And so if height is really the only thing that's changed, then you might be okay. So now I'm just going to show real briefly here. I'm going to switch my screen. So this is the Jawhawk Audubon website, and I have up the module for plants for birds. And this is where you can find some of the resources that I've been talking about. In the landscaping for birds, Sharon Ashworth with the Douglas County Extension Master Gardeners has written some tips there for landscaping for birds. You can also find on our website a little section on where to buy native plants. It's a little bit outdated. There are no native plant sales over the summer. Hopefully there'll be some coming up. But here there are some links to some places that do sell native plants. Again, always being cognizant of the fact that a lot of what might be sold as native could be cultivars of native. So you want to kind of take a look at that. But when there are native plant sales coming up locally, we'll put those on our website as well. Thing I want to show you here is you can get to this from our website here. There's a link here that says National Audubon's Database. That's the National Audubon Society Native Plant Database. And I have put into the search one of the zip codes for Wyandotte County. And so when I do that, let me go back to the beginning just to, I click on National Audubon's database. This is the home page for the National Audubon Society native plant database. And this is wherever you are in the whole country, you can punch in your zip code here and you can pull up a list of plants that are native to your area. Okay, so for that zip code, 66101, it says that the nearest Audubon is the Burroughs Audubon Society, that's in Kansas City. And then for native plants, there's best results, there's full results, and then local resources. I'm just gonna quick go to local resources to show you that in addition to having a link to the Burroughs Audubon Society, the Jawhawk Audubon Society, and our website is accessible there. The difference between best results and full results is best results are kind of more tailored toward what you could reasonably find in your area. There are whole bunches of native plants that just are not available through any plant sales or nurseries or anything like that. So it's good to know, and you might be interested in full results. Best results it's a shorter list to work with. And so then you can refine your search based on all types of plants, or say you just wanted to find annuals and perennials that attract caterpillars. And then it brings up a list, and this list is only 22 different plants. And so black-eyed Susan, butterfly milkweed, etc. Now I kind of talked about the solidagos as being really important, and I noticed, so you can actually do a search by keyword, solidago, and so then it brings up, oops, lost it. It brings up the Solidago nimeralis and Solidago rigida, only those two. Well, there's a whole bunch more. So then I would go to full results to see what else you can get for Solidago. And this elm leaf goldenrod, I don't know why it's not showing me the picture. That's not a great picture of it, but that's one that I've planted a lot of and it does really well. And then it tells you that it's good for fruit. It's got seeds, butterflies, caterpillars, and it'll attract all those different kinds of birds. So this is really where you want to go if you want to do a search for what plants are native in your area and what kind of birds they will attract. I think with that, are there any more questions, Lynn?
Comment, I've seen cardinals pick up Japanese beetles of my oak leaf hydrangea. Another comment, I've heard from the University of Illinois, where I am extension instructor, the recommendation to get plant from within 100 miles to the north and 200 miles to the south of where one lives. I recently read that double petaled flowers can be bred by having petals replace some or all of the stamens, which would reduce or eliminate pollen. I'm working on building the number of Echinacea pallida I have. Slow start, but I'm working on it. Something about small, but too small to read. If it's too small to read on your screen, this comment is for everyone. As I've been a previous presenter, you can take a screenshot and then later enlarge it as a photo, or you can simply go to the reference websites. Good suggestion. Is there a way to tell on the label if it is a native plant?
No. You can tell if something's a cultivar if it has the little fancy name in quotes at the end of it, like knee-high for the Echinacea. If it has a cute name, or Sugar Shack after the Cephalanthus, if it has that in little quotes afterwards, then you know that it's a cultivar. But whether it's actually native in your area, you have to do that research yourself. And so for Douglas County and the surrounding area, on our website, we have created a list of native plants. Not all native plants, but it's really based on plants that should do well in the garden and are likely to be available in our area. And that would be something if you're in other parts of Northeast Kansas, that might also be helpful for you.
Okay. There's also at least one sunflower that's in a different genus than Solidago. Can you remember what it is offhand?
No, I cannot. I'm sorry.
Okay. Can you share titles of publication?
Let's see. I'm not sure how to do that. The one book that we talked about was the one Doug Tallamy book, which was Bringing Nature Home. The other one was Nature's Best Hope. There you go. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Do you deadhead native flowers and plants?
Absolutely not. So we need those seeds for the winter, and deadheading is so unnecessary and so unhelpful. All it is, it's about beautifying, and I think that a beautiful garden is one that has a lot of wildlife, and so all those plants provide seeds, but they also provide, you know, some stems have larvae that are overwintering in them. Some seed heads have larvae overwintering in them. There's life in those dead stalks. So we definitely need to leave all that stuff. And it's structure. And over the winter, we need to have structure in our gardens.
I know we've certainly been instructed to not deadhead native plants in our Master Gardener group. Does anyone know about tansy?
It's pretty invasive.
Invasive, okay.
Non-native invasive. Get rid of it.
And then a question, what can we do to encourage local nurseries to carry more natives?
Yeah, excellent question. I think that that's really getting at the crux of the matter, is that a lot of nurseries do not carry true natives, and they don't even know what they are. So I think asking for them, and there is a wholesale native plant nursery south of Lawrence, and I don't know how they function, but for the Grassland Heritage Foundation, that's where they buy their native plants for their native plant sales. And I don't know if some of our other local nurseries can actually buy plants from that wholesaler, which is called Taylor Creek Nurseries, I think, down near Baldwin City. So I think we all need to be constantly asking at our nurseries for true native plants, and not cultivars, and certainly nothing that's been treated with neonicotinoids. So you guys can probably pronounce that better than I can, but I just call it neonics.
We have pipeline in the Turner Garden I planted, so I planted pipeline to attract pipeline swallowtails, not native, but moving north due to warming, question mark.
Well, yeah, that brings up a good question about, global warming and how we can be resilient to warming temperatures and other changes in our weather patterns.
Here's another one. You can do what is called Chelsea chop of late flowering plants, Joe Pye weed, New England asters, when they get about 15 inches tall before flowering, to encourage a shorter, more branching habit and more flowers, which may bloom a bit later. Not the same as deadheading, and may encourage people to plant more of these plants, which may otherwise get too tall for a small yard or garden. And then I collected seed from 3 feet high chicory and planted it. They are 6 feet high in my patch.
Chicory is not native.
So that concludes our comments.
Okay. Yeah, I feel your pain about not knowing where to buy native plants. And part of the problem is that it's tough. But the Missouri Prairie Foundation has a plant sale. I don't know about, the Douglas County Master Gardeners had a plant sale. I don't know if you guys have your own plant sale. I'm going to work on getting some more information on our website about native plant sales, even though they might not be happening right now, but where one could go later on to find out about them. Most of them are in April and May.
Well, thank you very much for an excellent presentation.